Take a deep breath. Let the day fade away. Feel the hush of night settle around you like a silken cloak. The air is warm and still, touched only by the whisper of olive trees. A faint breeze curls through forgotten stone corridors, where time sleeps in shadows and the moon keeps silent watch. Now, close your eyes. Let your thoughts drift like leaves across a sacred pool. Our story begins where statues sleep. Long ago, before even the stories of heroes were stories, there stood a temple not marked on any scroll. It sat nestled between the cliffs of Aegean, an island that appears on no modern map. No city grew there, no ships docked, and no priestess tended its halls. It was a temple that existed for dreams alone. The people of nearby islands whispered of it in half-sleep, of marble faces that wept in moonlight, of columns that sighed when touched by wind, of a door that never opened and never needed to. But those who dared draw closer found only ruins, cracked stone, faded frescoes, vines that climbed like old memories across statues of sleeping gods. No one remembered what god the temple belonged to, or if it had ever truly been built, but the statues remembered, and on certain nights, when the sky turned, the color of old parchment and stars blinked like forgotten names. The temple stirred, not in stone, but in silence. This story is not about a king or a warrior. This is the story of a girl. Her name was Ione. She was not royal, not divine, just a quiet girl who liked to sit by the edge of things, the edge of the sea, the edge of town, the edge of stories. She lived with her grandfather in a modest stone cottage beside the wild thyme hills of Delphinia. He was once a sculptor, a great one by the villagers' measure. But age had turned his hammer to a cane and his hands to curled roots. Still, he carved, slowly, patiently, with the memory of muscle. If not the strength, each day, Ione would return from gathering herbs and figs, and find him asleep in his chair, dusted in marble shavings. Each night she would sit by the window and watch the moon rise like a slow-breathing oracle over the hills. And when the wind was just right, she would hear it, a song in the stone. It was not melody, exactly, not words, just a feeling, soft, lonely, old. Her grandfather had once whispered to her in one of his more lucid evenings, "Statues don't sleep, child. They wait, and the good ones dream." She didn't know what he meant, but the words rooted in her. One summer, when the skies forgot to rain and the fields turned brittle as parchment, Ione walked further than she ever had before, past the thyme hills, past the cypress grove, past even the shepherd stones etched with weathered names. She carried no map, only a satchel of honeyed bread, a vial of rose water, and a soft, round stone from her grandfather's workshop, and a question tucked beneath her ribs like a seashell against the heart. Can a temple be forgotten if someone remembers it? The air that day was strange, not hot, not cool, just suspended, like the moment before a coin falls. She crossed a narrow ravine and came upon a clearing she had never seen, though she had walked these lands since childhood. The grass here grew in spirals. The trees leaned inward, and at the center, beneath a cloak of vines and shadow, stood the temple, not in grandeur, not in ruin, but in stillness, like a dream half remembered, or a story once told in sleep. Ione stepped through its threshold. Door blocked her. Only columns, fluted and tall, like silent sentinels of time. Inside, coolness wrapped around her, like the undercurrent of a well. Dust floated in beams of soft light, catching on the curves of forgotten gods. Statues lined the hall, dozens, maybe more. Not one the same. Faces in sorrow, faces in joy, faces in neither, and all with closed eyes. She walked among them, her sandals barely whispering on the stone. She stopped before one, a woman carved in moonstone, kneeling, hands cupped as if holding water that was no longer there. Her hair was swept back, face serene, lips parted just slightly. Ione felt her breath hitch. There was something familiar about her. Not the features, but the feeling. As if she had heard her voice once. In a dream, she reached out, fingers trembling, and placed the smooth stone from her satchel into the woman's cupped hands. The air around her shifted, a breeze, from where she couldn't say. Then a sound, not from outside, from within the statue. A soft sigh, almost a yawn. She stepped back, eyes wide, but the statue remained still, the temple. Though the temple was not as quiet as before, somewhere deeper she heard a hush, a turning, a stone breath. The temple was waking. Rest now, let the mystery gently unfold. You've entered the dream, but the dream is not yet done. Here is part 2 of 12 of When Statues Sleep, a temple's forgotten dream. 1,000 words settle again. Feel the hush deepen. The temple breathes now, not with lungs, but with memory. You are not just hearing a story, you are stepping inside it. Ione didn't run, though her heart beat like a festival drum. Something deeper, quieter, told her not to fear. The statues weren't waking in rage or wrath. They were stirring like sleepers warmed by sunlight. Not warriors roused to arms. Still, she stepped lightly as she moved deeper into the temple. The inner sanctum was barely visible. The walls bore no torch, yet the stones glowed faintly with hues of pearl and sea grey, as though moonlight was stitched into the rock itself. The scent of thyme and cold water drifted faintly through the air, as if the breeze remembered the mountains she had crossed to get here. At the far end stood the largest statue yet. It was not of a god, not a king, not a beast or maiden. It was a child, a boy, perhaps 10 or 11, kneeling as if listening to something below the earth. One hand cupped to the stone floor, the other raised palm, open, reaching. His eyes were shut like the others, but unlike the others, his lips were pressed together, not in peace, but in uncertainty. Ione knelt before him. There was a quiet humming beneath the marble, not sound, not song, but vibration, a pulse she could feel in her bones. Without knowing why, she reached into her satchel and withdrew the vial of rose water. A gift her grandfather had once said was fit for old gods and older wounds. She unscrewed the cork and let a few drops fall into the cupped hand of the child statue. At first silence, then a single note, clear, rising, thin as mist. It came not from the vial, not from the statue's lips, but from beneath the temple. The floor beneath Ione's knees trembled, not violently, gently, as though a stone heart had remembered how to beat. She stepped back, and then the boy statue opened his eyes. They weren't made of marble, not anymore. They shimmered deep silver blue, like the surface of a sacred Springsteen through morning. Fog. He blinked once, twice, and then spoke. You heard it too, didn't you? His voice was soft, echoless, as though it traveled through time, not space. Ione opened her mouth, but no words came. The statue boy stood slowly. The joints of his limbs moved like those of someone waking from 1,000-year sleep, unsure. stiff but curious. "The silence has cracked," he said. "The dream is remembering itself." He turned and looked at the statue of the kneeling woman, the one Ione had offered the smooth stone to earlier. "She was the keeper of the first echo," he murmured. "She remembered the ocean when it had no name. You woke her. That means you're part of the story now." I don't understand," Ione finally whispered. The boy smiled, not unkindly, but like someone who had been alone too long to know what kindness felt like anymore. "Neither do I, but that's how dreaming works. You don't understand it until after you wake." He stepped past her and gestured toward a narrow stairwell that had not been there before, a spiral descent, carved from coral-colored stone, descending beneath the temple's base. "The others are waiting. They can't speak yet. Not until the story has been walked. Will you come?" Ione hesitated. Her body said no. Her spirit leaned forward, and then she stepped after him into the stairs. The air below was cool and tasted like forgotten songs. There were no torches, yet the walls shimmered with a bioluminescent gleam, soft purples, sea greens, hints of gold. Symbols danced along the walls, not written, but formed by veins in the rock. As they descended, the boy spoke gently, as though afraid too much volume would disturb the dream. "They built this temple not to worship, but to remember. Not all temples were made for gods. Some were made for silence, for holding what the world wanted to forget." "Like what?" Ione asked, her voice no louder than a breath. He didn't answer, but the wall beside her did. The veins shifted, and a scene emerged. Ships burning on the sea, cities swallowed by waves, a woman in a golden mask weeping into her hands. Then it faded. Ione stopped walking. "Was that real?" The boy nodded. "All memory is real somewhere." They continued downward. Another image emerged, a child singing. To a fountain, a lion resting its head in a philosopher's lap, stars falling like rain onto a temple roof. Ione touched the stone. It was warm. Each memory, each vision, felt both ancient and deeply familiar, as though she'd seen them in dreams long ago and only just now remembered. Finally, they reached a circular chamber. At the center was a pool, still as a held breath, and around it 6 more statues, each of them incomplete, missing a hand, a face, an eye. Each beautiful, each asleep. The boy turned to her. "They are parts of the same memory, fractured, waiting to be sung whole again." Ione stepped forward, her voice barely a whisper. "How?" The boy placed a hand over the pool. "Tell the dream. You're still with me, dreamer. The temple hushes around you, not in fear, but reverence. You've crossed the veil of story, and now we listen together." Ione stared at the boy, unsure if she had heard him right. "Tell the dream," she echoed. He nodded once, solemn. "Every statue here is a fragment of someone, of something, a song, a sorrow, a truth, and only when their stories are remembered aloud can they become whole again." He stepped aside and gestured toward the first statue, half buried in the curve of the pool. This one was a woman, eyes closed, a harp cradled in her lap, though its strings were shattered. Her lips were parted as if mid-note, but no sound emerged. Ione approached her gently. "I don't know what to say." "Then begin with what you feel," said the boy. She took a breath, and the air shifted. It was subtle, the way dusk turns. Tonight, not with a sound, but a presence. The stillness deepened. Ione's voice trembled at first. "I see a song you once played, one that made even the gods pause. As she spoke, the broken strings of the harp shimmered faintly, not mending but humming. I see you in a chamber of moonlight, surrounded by listeners who wept without knowing why. The statue's lips curved slightly, and I see the silence. That followed, not because your voice ended, but because the world forgot to listen. A single string on the harp reformed, golden, soft dash, glowing dot. The boy smiled. She hears you. Encouraged, I only turned to the next statue. A bearded figure, only half his face intact, with one hand reaching upward, the other clenched in a fist. I see a man who once questioned everything, she said. Her words floated, gentle but certain. You stood in the court of kings and asked what truth was without kindness. You were laughed at, weren't you? Banished for teaching children to wonder. The broken half of the face pulsed with faint light, and though they tried to erase you, you carved your questions into stone. That stone is this room. That question is still breathing. A ripple crossed the pool's surface. The boy looked toward the remaining figures. You're remembering them, he whispered, and they're remembering you. One by one, Ione moved around the circle, speaking dreams she didn't know she had, naming moments she'd never lived, but somehow carried. A child statue with wings folded tight. She called her the sleeper who waited for spring. A statue missing its eyes, yet kneeling as if listening, the listener beneath. The storm. Each name she gave, each story she spoke, brought the chamber more alive. The statues didn't fully awaken, but they shimmered now, as if caught between worlds, no longer just stone, not yet human. The final statue was unlike the others. It had no head. Its arms were wrapped around something invisible, a shape long since weathered away. But when Ione stood before it, her heart ached with a strange, unnameable grief. She knelt. I don't know who you are, she whispered, but I feel you. You held something once, someone, and then you lost them so completely the world couldn't even remember what you held. She placed a hand gently on the statue's arms. I remember your loss, even if I can't name it. A warmth radiated from the stone, then silence. The boy knelt beside her. You've done it. You've named what couldn't be named. That is the beginning. And then, without warning, the pool began to glow. Not with fire, not with light, but with memory. Visions swirled beneath its surface. An entire city sculpted from alabaster and blue marble, high atop a cliff where children laughed between columns and philosophers taught by waterfalls. A temple, this temple in its full glory, filled not with worshippers but with dreamers, artists, seekers of the unspeakable. Ione gasped. This place was real. The boy's face grew solemn. It was, before the world turned its face from wonder, before the gods fell asleep, before statues were locked in silence. He stood, and now it remembers itself because of you. As if in response to his words, a faint wind stirred the chamber, not from above, but from within the very walls. The 6 statues around the pool shimmered once more, and then exhaled. Each let out a breath they had been holding for 1,000 years. Not words, but peace. And with that breath, something beautiful happened. The temple shifted, not physically, but emotionally. Where before it had been heavy with forgetting, now it hummed with presence. Not loud, not triumphant, just awake. The boy looked at her. You can stay if you wish, or return. Ione swallowed. What happens if I stay? You become part of the dream, a keeper of what sleeps. And, if I return, you carry the song with you, into a world that has forgotten how to listen. The choice hung in the air like dawn before the sun crests the hill. Ione looked around the chamber at the remembered statues, the glowing pool, the symbols, the stone. Then she looked at the boy. You'll be here either way. He nodded, until the last echo fades. Ione took a long breath and turned toward the stairs. The temple does not close behind her, because this isn't an ending. Here is part 4 of 12 of When Statues Sleep, a temple's forgotten dream, approximately 1,000 words. Welcome back. Dreamer, you've climbed the steps from memory, but the story still lingers in your bones. You carry with you more than silence now. You carry the echo of those who were once forgotten. Ione emerged into the evening light. The sky over Delos was a palette of molten amber and violet, the stars preparing to blink open. The sea wind kissed her cheeks like an old friend, but the world, though seemingly unchanged, shimmered differently to her eyes now. The temple had not simply been a place, it had been a truth, and truth, once seen, doesn't let go. She walked slowly along the hillside path, past sleeping olive groves and low, crumbling walls bathed in dusk. No one called her name. No torches lit her return. But the hush of the island no longer felt like absence. It felt like listening. Her fingers still tingled from touching the statues. Her breath felt deeper, slower, and when she paused near the shrine of Apollo, where tourists usually placed coins and whispered wishes, she no longer saw a stone platform. She saw echoes, a gathering of voices, a memory of music in the cracks of marble. I can hear you now, she murmured. Behind her, the night deepened, and so did her purpose. The following days blurred, not because they were unimportant, but because the world of the waking often moves too quickly for dreamers. Returned from silence, Ione tried to resume her routine. She helped the temple guides, translating inscriptions for guests who passed by, more interested in snapping photos than asking questions. She sat near the ruins at twilight, sketching not what she saw, but what she remembered. She tried to write down what she had witnessed, but the words escaped her. Every sentence felt too small, too stiff. The memory of the sleeping statues was not made of letters. It was breath, vibration, presence. One evening she sat beside her grandmother's hearth, quiet while soup simmered. Her grandmother, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, watched her for a long time. "You've seen something," the old woman said at last. Ione looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" "I know the look," said her grandmother. "It's the same one your grandfather had when he came back from the mountains. Said he met a shepherd who wasn't there, and heard a flute that played without fingers." Ione hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I found a chamber, under the ruins, statues, but not broken, sleeping, and a boy who told me to remember them. And when I did, the whole place came alive." Her grandmother didn't laugh. She didn't scoff or dismiss her with talk of sunstroke or dreams. She only stirred the soup once, then set the spoon down gently. "And did they tell you what they wanted?" "They didn't have to," said Ione. "They needed someone to speak their names, to tell their dreams again. Otherwise, they stay forgotten, like echoes without walls." Her grandmother gave a small, knowing smile. "Then tell them I tried," Ione said, her voice tight, "but words aren't enough." "Then use more than words," said the old woman. "Use silence, use rhythm, use breath. You're not writing a scroll, girl. You're planting a song." That night, Ione did not write. she sang, not with lyrics, not with melody in the traditional sense. She sat in her room with the lamp low, and hummed the tones she remembered from the chamber, tones that moved like water on marble, tones that felt like walking barefoot across cool stone or pressing one's palm to a statue's cheek. She filled a book not with sentences, but with sketches, with spirals and arches, drawings of the winged child and the listening man and the woman with the broken harp. Her hands remembered better than her mouth did, and as she drew, a thought began to grow. What if others could see this, feel this, not read about it, but experience it? A week later, she returned to the ruins, not to descend again, but to offer something above. She brought with her a circle of white pebbles, arranged near the entrance, each painted with a simple image: an ear, a harp, an open eye, a closed hand. Passers-by paused, puzzled. "What is this?" asked a man with a camera. "A memory," she said softly, waiting to be heard. Soon, others began to stop. Some whispered to the stones, others sat in silence beside them. A few children sang small tunes, without knowing why. The temple, once only a stop on a tourist path, began to feel different, not louder, but more attentive. Words spread, not as a sensation, not as a headline, but quietly, as most truths do. Artists arrived and painted murals of statues that weren't in any guidebook. Poets came and left behind folded pages tucked into cracks in the wall. A woman from a nearby island left offerings of lavender and salt near the olive tree, not to Apollo, but to the dreamers who wait. Something had shifted, not in the world, in the people who walked through it. And one morning, just as the dawn cracked open the sky, Ione returned to the entrance of the ruins and found a child waiting there, a boy with eyes like carved basalt and skin dusted with marble grey. He looked up at her and smiled. "You've kept the dream alive." She knelt down, heart full. "You came back." "I never left," he whispered. "Not really. You carried me." They sat in silence for a while, and then, together, they hummed the first note of a new song. The temple is no longer silent. Not loud, not busy, but heard. Here is part 5 of 12 of When Statues Sleep, a temple's forgotten dream. 1,000 words, the summer wind began to change. It no longer passed through Delos like a mere breeze. It moved like a whisper between centuries. Each time it curved through the temple ruins, rustled the wild herbs between the stones, or tugged at the strings of lyres carried by wandering musicians. It felt purposeful, as if it was listening, as if it was remembering. And Ione, she had become the memory's voice, not in fame, not in grandeur. She still slept in the same small bed with its thin linen sheets, and still shared morning olives with her grandmother, who sometimes chuckled without explanation and hummed a lullaby no one else remembered. But the dream that had once been buried beneath the temple now walked in the air, and every step Ione took was part of it. One afternoon, as the island baked under the golden weight of late summer, a small group of visitors stepped off a boat not marked on any registry. They wore pale linen robes, sandals woven from reeds, and no emblems of state or religion. Each one carried a curved staff etched with tiny geometric spirals. Their eyes were calm but watchful, like those of owls or librarians. Ione saw them from a distance. From where she was sketching fragments of a broken frieze, she felt the change in the air, like when clouds pass in front of the sun. The world didn't darken, but paused. The figures made no announcement. They wandered the temple slowly, reverently, pausing at places no guidebook marked. One bent down to touch a half-buried stone, closed his eyes, and nodded faintly. Another stood before a cracked column and began to hum a low, soft tone that made the nearby grasses quiver. It wasn't long before one of them approached Ione, a woman older than most tourists, with silver in her braid and hands weathered like driftwood. Her eyes were green, mossy, with flecks of gold. She didn't speak right away, only studied. Ione's face was something between kindness and awe. "You're the one they whispered about," she said gently. Ione blinked. "Who whispered?" "The stone," said the woman, placing a hand to the earth, the memory that never faded, only waited. "Some of us listen for such things." "Are you archaeologists?" Ione asked. The woman shook her head slowly. "No, keepers, not of objects, of breath, of dreams." Another stepped forward, this one younger, a boy of maybe 17, eyes shy but curious. He held out a small woven pouch. "For you," he said. "A seed, grown from silence." Inside, Ione found a stone, round, flat, smooth as glass. It was carved with the same spiral symbol she had seen in the hidden chamber. Her breath caught. "You've seen them," she whispered. "No," said the boy, "but they see us. Through you." That night, Ione lit no candle. She sat in the dark beside her open window, the salt air drifting in, the stars above like forgotten gods watching in peace. She held the spiral, stone in her hands, and closed her eyes. In the distance, a soft tone rang out, not from the earth, not from the sea, but from somewhere beneath thought. She followed it. She dreamed again, not of the chamber, but of the island. It rose beneath her feet, as though time itself were unraveling. Statues once broken were whole, temples reassembled, not with mortar, but with memory. People moved through the streets, not tourists, but inhabitants, draped in linen, speaking in low tones, singing softly to their children. And in the center of it all stood a tall figure, cloaked in white, their face ageless, their eyes closed. The dreamer. Their voice came not as sound but sensation. "You have stirred the still water," they said, "but now comes the ripple." When she awoke, the sea was calm, but her soul was not. The next day, Ione returned to the ruins, not to draw or to sit, but to build. She cleared a circle near the temple's base, not on it, not against it, but beside it, under a small olive tree that had rooted stubbornly through cracks in the foundation. With stones, sand, and driftwood, she created a shape, a spiral encircling a seat in the center. The seat faced east, toward the rising sun. Around the spiral, she placed 7 flat stones. On each, she painted a word in ancient Greek. Listen, breathe, remember, speak, honor, rest, begin. No sign explained it. No rope barred the path, but people came, they sat, they breathed. Some cried, some fell silent for long stretches, and left with new light in their eyes. Ione's circle became known not as a shrine, but as a pause. Locals called it strophe, a turning point in music or poetry. Visitors who truly came to feel the island, not just to see it, were guided there by soft suggestion from innkeepers and vendors. They left shells in the center, poems in folded parchment, small offerings of herbs, carved wood, handmade beads, and each night the wind carried something different through the air, something like a song trying to find its final verse. Late one evening, Ione stood at the spiral's edge, watching the stars wheel over the old stones. She felt a warmth rise in her chest, not pride, not accomplishment, but connection, as if she were not standing alone, but with all those who had once dreamed here. All those who had spoken, loved, wept, and waited in the temple's long shadow. And when she closed her eyes, she heard them again, not in words, but in presence. You are not a guide. You are not a priestess. You are not a keeper of the old world. You are a bridge. Walk gently, and others will follow. The statues do not speak in thunder. They speak in footsteps, in echoes, in dreams. The days began to carry new silence, not the kind of stillness that made people uneasy, but the soft hush that settles when something sacred is near. Word had spread, not in headlines or temple tours, but through murmured stories over wine, in sea-facing taverns. In the sun-warmed shade of fig trees, visitors came without guidebooks. They sat at Ione's spiral not to learn history, but to remember it. Even the cats, those silent citizens of Delos, had started to linger at the circles, edge curling into sunspots on the sacred stones, as if remembering a world before words and Ione. Ione had begun to dream even when awake. She would walk the temple grounds and feel time blur, see flickers of white-robed women tending to olive lamps, hear the faint clang of bronze against marble, smell the incense of 1,000 years ago, still wafting on the sea breeze. But it wasn't haunting. It was homecoming one morning. As dawn painted the sea in gold and milk, Ione found something nestled where the spiral met the olive tree. Not an offering, not a message, but a mask. It was delicate, made not of wood or clay, but interwoven leaves, dried and bleached by the sun. Its shape was neither male nor female, neither smiling nor sorrowful. It bore the soft suggestion of presence, a face without age, without need for words. Attached was a small ribbon of woven seagrass, bearing a single phrase in ancient Greek, for the dream to wear itself again. Ione did not know who had left it, but her hands trembled when she picked it up. She pressed the mask to her face. The wind held its breath, and suddenly everything changed. The moment the mask touched her skin, the world around her fell silent, not emptied, but deepened. The air grew thicker with meaning, as though the land beneath her was no longer just dust and ruin, but memory waiting to be spoken. She opened her eyes, and saw, not with her usual sight, but through the eyes of the temple. Itself the columns rose not in ruin, but in gleaming glory. The statues were not weathered. They moved, softly, as if just returned from a long breath. They turned their marble heads toward her, and though their mouths did not part, their presence sang. She walked the great hall, where once voices of oracles and hymns had echoed now. Only the dream voice remained, and it whispered, "Do you remember us now?" She saw her younger self sitting among broken pillars, tracing her fingers along cracked inscriptions, asking the wind for answers. She saw her mother laughing, brushing sand from her knees, calling her to supper, humming the same lullaby. Each night she saw the dreamer again, not towering, not shrouded, but beside her. This time their face was hers, and when they spoke, it came not from lips, but from every surface around her. "You are not here to revive us. We do not need revival. We need remembrance, and through you we dream again." She fell to her knees, not in fear, but in recognition. Tears traced clean paths down her cheeks. The mask lifted gently from her face, not torn, not pulled, but released like a tide receding after whispering its secret to the shore. And when she opened her eyes again, the temple had returned to its current form, but everything had changed, because now she carried its voice in the days that followed. The circle became something more than a resting place. It became a mirror, not glass or water, but a mirror of the spirit. People would sit and see themselves not as tourists or scholars, but as threads in a greater tapestry. A father came with his daughter and left behind a clay figure they'd sculpted together, an elderly woman from Naxos, who had once danced at a temple festival in her youth, wept openly and kissed the stones. A mute boy placed his hand to the earth and began humming softly, and for the first time. His mother saw him smile without fear, and through it all, Ione remained a quiet presence, not leading, not teaching, just being. She didn't publish her findings, didn't chase the attention others urged her to seek. Instead, she tended the spiral. She listened, and at night, she sang the old lullabies she once heard from her grandmother, not for others, but for the statues, for the sleeping dream, for the presence that had never truly left. One evening, as the horizon faded from gold to deep indigo, a scholar from the mainland approached her. He had a satchel of maps, scrolls, and notes, and a voice trained in lecture halls. "I've read about your work," he said, "what you're doing here. It's unlike anything in the modern canon. There's potential for excavation, preservation grants, even museum installations. With your insights," she stopped him gently, with a hand placed over her heart. "I'm not unearthing," she said. "I'm listening, but these ruins are not sleeping," she replied. "They are dreaming, and dreams do not survive when dissected. They survive when honored." The scholar looked puzzled, almost uncomfortable, and then moved, for he knelt by the spiral and stayed until the stars came out. That night, as she walked home, a new breeze curled through the temple. It wasn't carrying a message, it was the message, a breeze shaped by presence, by memory, by a girl who had once spoken to stone, and now heard it whisper back. "And if you close your eyes now, dear dreamer, you might feel that same breeze brushing your cheek. You might hear the hush of centuries stirring softly in the dark, not calling to be rescued, but to be remembered." Here is part 7 of 12 of When Statues Sleep, a temple's forgotten dream. Approximately 1,000 words. The moon hung low over Delos, full and silver, casting a path of light across the Aegean like a trail only dreamers could follow. In the gentle shadows of the sleeping temple, the air pulsed with a kind of invisible music, ancient, slow, the rhythm of breath and memory, not meant for ears but for the soul. That night, Ione did not sleep, not because she was restless, but because she couldn't bear to miss the stillness, the kind of stillness that only existed between moonlight and dawn. She sat at the foot of the olive tree, mask in her lap, listening to the rustle of the leaves. Each breeze carried with it a scent: lavender, brine, old stone, warmed by sun, and something deeper. A scent that felt like nostalgia before it even became memory. The spiral beneath her feet seemed warmer than the earth around it, as if the temple, in its own silent language, recognized her, honored her, trusted her. From the darkened edge of the ruins, a voice spoke softly. "You wait as if for someone." Ione turned. It was an old woman, unfamiliar, though not unkind. Her robes were pale blue, her hair silver, her eyes the color of dusk before stars appear. "I listen," Ione replied. The woman stepped forward without sound. "Listening is Rare these days, most prefer to speak. They fear what silence may say. The woman smiled, and something about that smile reminded Ione of statues, serene, composed, eternal. And what has it said to you, child? That the dream is still breathing, Ione said. That stone remembers what scrolls forget. That not all truths are meant to be proven, only protected. The woman sat beside her on the stone. You carry the weight well, she murmured. But do you understand what it is you're carrying? Ione looked down at the spiral. Her fingers traced its path. It's not a story, she said. Not just a myth. It's a promise, left behind in silence, waiting for someone to hear. And now that you have. I'm not sure, she said. I think the dream is asking me to hold it, not own it, not speak for it. Just hold it. The woman nodded slowly. That is all the old gods ever wanted, she said. Not shrines or statues, just remembrance, a home in the heart. They sat in silence as crickets sang and the waves kissed the shore. After a time, the woman stood. I was once like you, she said. Young, searching. I followed myths across islands, spoke to winds, listened to the cracks in marble. And then I forgot. She touched Ione's shoulder gently. Don't forget, no matter how loud the world becomes. Then she walked away, not fading, but receding, like a wave returning to the deep dot. And though Ione could not explain why, she knew the woman was not truly gone. Some part of her belonged to the temple, to dock the next morning as golden light poured across the ruins. Ione placed the leaf-woven mask upon a small stone shelf near the spiral. She did not hide it, did not guard it. She simply placed it where the wind could reach it. It was not hers to keep. It was never about ownership. It was about presence. She turned toward the path, ready to return to the village for fresh bread, when she saw something remarkable. At the temple's threshold stood a boy, perhaps 10 or 11, holding a jar of honey and a fistful of wild thyme. He bowed quietly and placed them on the steps. Then, with great care, he sat cross-legged before the spiral and closed his eyes. He didn't speak. He simply listened, and Ione knew the dream was working. Not loudly, not with spectacle, but like roots beneath soil, like stars behind clouds, like voices beneath waves, growing, becoming, remembered. Later that week, 2 archaeologists from Athens arrived, drawn by rumors and whispers. They were skeptical, as scientists often are, but they were kind. Ione welcomed them, walked them through the ruins, showed them nothing of grandeur, only of stillness. They examined the spiral, the olive tree, the mask. They asked questions, not of grandeur or gold, but of meaning. At the end of their visit, one of them sat quietly at the edge of the sanctuary, notebook untouched. He said, I came looking for artifacts. I think I found atmosphere. And that, Ione thought, was enough. Each evening, she would light a small oil lamp at the spirals, scented not for worship, but for warmth. She didn't need words anymore. The temple knew her by presence now, and she knew it by echo. The listener, and each evening she would walk the spiral, then sit beside the olive tree dot, not to watch, but to wait, not for anything in particular, but for whatever the temple wished to remember next, because she now knew when statues sleep, they do not forget, they dream, and when we are ready, we may dream with them. The seasons turned gently, like the pages of an ancient book whose binding had long since surrendered to time. Rain fell softly on the marble colonnades, not to erode them, but to anoint them. In spring, wild poppies spilled across the temple steps. In autumn, golden leaves from the olive tree drifted through the open sanctuary like forgotten hymns. Ione had grown into silence, the way vines grow around stone, not choking it, but embracing it. Visitors still came, but she had stopped asking them where they were from or why they'd come. They would arrive, walk the spiral in their own way, leave behind a token, a feather, a folded scrap of poetry, a broken ring, even a single tear, and then they would go, often without speaking, and the temple would breathe them in. There was something living here, not the gods carved into the statues. Not exactly, but something, a quiet pulse beneath the earth, a presence that seemed to hold everything, not with ownership, but with understanding, like an old friend who never interrupts. One dusky evening, just before the stars arrived, Ione found something she hadn't expected, a statue that had changed it. Was the one in the western alcove, the figure of a man always seated, with hands cupped as though catching rain, but tonight, in the curve of his stone palms, lay a single olive blossom, fresh, blue, still fragrant. Ione touched it carefully, expecting it to crumble into dust. It deigned single quotes, and as she stood in silence, a memory pressed into her mind like mist against skin. A young sculptor, years ago, placing the final touch on the statue's face, not a perfect nose or heroic jaw, but a half smile, a quiet admission that perfection wasn't the point, that presence was. She blinked. The statue hadn't moved, and yet it had changed. Or perhaps she had. That night she dreamed, not in pictures, but in feeling. She was water flowing over stone. She was roots winding through ruins. She was breath drawn into lungs that had not belonged to her. And she was voice, not speaking, not singing, but holding sound. The way the sky holds starlight, the way the sea holds grief. She awoke at dawn, with a strange word resting on her lips. Not in Greek, not in any language she knew, but it tasted like cinnamon, and salt, and rain. She wrote it down on a scrap of cloth, and left it on the altar by nightfall. It had vanished. One morning, a child arrived. No parent, no guide. Just a small boy with dust on his feet and a pebble in each pocket. He said nothing as he entered the spiral. He walked it slowly, stumbling once, then finding his rhythm at the center, he took the pebbles from his pocket and stacked them, one on top of the other, until they stood like a tiny tower. Then he sat beside it and waited for hours. Ione brought him figs and water, which he accepted with a nod. When the sun began to set, he rose, whispered something to the stones, too soft for her to hear, and walked away. The tower remained. 3 days later, it was still standing, but now there was a fourth pebble, and neither she nor the wind had placed it there. By now, Ione no longer doubted. The temple was alive, not with beating hearts or moving limbs, but with dreams that remembered more than any scroll ever could. It was not haunted. It was hauntingly awake, and those who stepped through its arches, even briefly, lent it something, a layer, a note, a single breath, and in return it offered them memory, not always of their own past, sometimes of something deeper, older, as though the earth itself was telling them, you are part of the dream too. The olive tree bore fruit that glowed faintly silver under moonlight. Not always, only on the nights when the statues seemed to lean slightly toward one another. Ione would sometimes sit in the inner sanctum and hum without melody, just sound. offered like a cup of water left for a traveler who might be late in coming, and sometimes, faintly, she would hear harmony in reply. Not echo, not imagination, but memory, sung back to her in a language the stones still remembered. She began to call it Stone-Song, not in public, just in her heart. It felt right, one twilight. She lit a single lamp in the center of the sanctuary and waited. She didn't know for what, only that something was about to turn, not end, not begin, just turn. A quiet threshold. The air stilled. The statues, bathed in the golden hush of evening, seemed to lean slightly inward. And then something happened, not with sound, not with movement, but with presence, like a page being turned in a book. You didn't know you were reading. The temple exhaled, and she knew a dream had returned. Not hers, not someone's, but the temple's own. A dream it had been waiting to remember, and now it would be told. The night was thick with stars, not scattered, but gathered, as though the sky itself had leaned closer to listen. The olive tree's silver leaves barely moved, yet the air shimmered with expectation, as if every stone, every breath of earth beneath the temple, had paused to remember. Ione stood in the sanctuary's heart. She felt it then, the difference, not in what she saw, but what she didn't. No absence, no emptiness, just presence, as though the dream itself, the one the temple had held, long slumbering beneath layers of moss and memory, had finally awoken. But unlike waking with light or sound, it had awoken as a feeling, a warmth, a stillness that hummed. She knelt before the altar, not in worship, but in welcome. There was no statue here. There never had been. Just a simple stone basin filled with water. Tonight it glowed, soft, pale blue, like starlight made liquid. Ione looked into it, expecting a reflection, but what she saw instead was story in the basin's glow, the past, unfolded like slow-turning leaves. A time when the temple was new, its marble bright, its columns unchipped, the air full of incense and laughter. There were dancers, children weaving flower crowns, music carried on lyres and soft drums, but most of all, dreams. People did not come here for miracles. They came to sleep, to lay down beside the olive tree or under the stars, and invite dreams into them, not to solve, not to interpret, but to become part of each dream left behind. A whisper, a trace, and slowly, over decades and centuries, those dreams began to root in the walls, in the statues, in the stones. The temple was never a shrine to gods. It was a sanctuary of human memory, a cathedral of sleeping truth. And then the scene changed. The sanctuary darkened, not from night, but from forgetting. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. The language of dreams was pushed aside for louder tongues. The temple was abandoned, not destroyed, only dismissed, and yet it had waited, not sadly, not bitterly, just patiently, like stone always does, until someone came who was quiet enough to listen, who carried no prophecy, no agenda, only wonder. And that, Ione realized, had always been the key. The temple didn't need priests. It needed witnesses, people willing to be still, long enough to feel the echo, to sense the dream humming beneath time. The vision faded, the water dimmed. Ione stood slowly, heart calm. She didn't need to tell anyone, didn't need to write scrolls or gather scholars. That wasn't the temple's way. Its truths weren't meant to be spoken in debate halls or etched in marble. They were meant to be felt, like the moment before sleep, like the hush in a cave, like the breath just before a statue's eyes might open. A few weeks later, a traveler came, an old woman with hands like paper and eyes that had seen too much. She didn't ask questions, didn't offer praise. She sat in the shadow of the olive tree and wept quietly, not from pain, but from remembering something she didn't know she'd forgotten. When she left, she placed a small mirror beside the basin. On the back, scratched into the bronze, was a single word: still. Years passed. The temple did not change, but it did not stay the same either. Its dream deepened. Visitors brought their silence, their stories, their questions, and the temple welcomed them all, not with answers, but with echoes. Sometimes a pebble would shift on its own. Sometimes a statue's shadow would fall differently, as if it had turned just slightly in the night. And sometimes, in the very quietest hours, you could hear humming, not from voices, from memory, the sound of every dream that had ever passed through these stones. Returning like waves to shore, Ione never left. Not because she couldn't, but because she didn't need to. The temple was not a prison. It was a breath that continued, a heartbeat of stone, a lullaby cradled in olive leaves. She became part of it, not like moss or root, but like rhythm, a voice that never sang, yet was always singing. And now, if you ever walk far enough into the hills of ancient soil, past the broken paths and whispering trees, you might find it, a forgotten temple, half sunk into the land, open to the stars. You might find the spiral stones, the basin, the olive tree, and, if you listen very closely, you might hear the statues dreaming, still, softly, as they always have. And somewhere, in the quietest corner of the sanctuary, a single shell-shaped lamp flickers in the wind, never quite going out. It's not there to light the path, only to say, you are part of the dream now. In the quiet weeks that followed, the weather turned cooler. Autumn slipped its gold into the leaves, and the olive trees whispered more than they rustled. Mist began to curl through the temple paths each dawn, soft and slow, like forgotten breath, rising from slumber. The stones, now worn smooth by pilgrims' feet, gleamed with the kind of grace only time can paint. Ione began to spend more time at the temple's edge, not in the sanctum, not among the statues, but at the low eastern wall where the land dropped off into the sea. From there, she could watch the tides roll in and out. Like long thoughts the ocean hadn't finished thinking. Some mornings, she would sit silently and draw spirals in the sand with her finger. Other days, she would speak, not aloud, but within, not to the gods, not to herself, but to the temple, and something always listened back. One day, a scholar arrived from Athens. He wore robes far too fine for the salt air and shoes that scuffed noisily against the stone paths. His eyes were sharp, calculating, not cruel, but clinical. He introduced himself as Mentes, and claimed he was researching unusual spiritual phenomena in post-Hellenic structures. Ione merely nodded and showed him the way in. He asked many questions about the layout, the carvings, the specific year it was likely built, about the shape of the spiral and the absence of inscriptions. He noted, with mild irritation, that none of the statues had names. Curious, he said, tapping his stylus. Every temple statue ought to depict someone, a god, a hero, a symbol. But these, he gestured toward the silent marble figures, these are like ... empty portraits. Ione said nothing. She merely walked him to the edge of the sanctuary, then left him to study. Hours passed. The sun drooped behind clouds shaped like sleeping lions. Evening settled, its lavender breath across the temple, and still the scholar did not move. He stood before the spiral, frozen, one hand half outstretched, as if reaching for something that couldn't be touched. Finally, he sat, not on a bench, but on the ground, and he wept, not in anguish, but in recognition. Later, he would say nothing of what he felt that night, but he left behind his notebook, open to a page with one sentence, scribbled with trembling hands. What if divinity never wanted temples, only memory? That winter, the sea grew restless. Not violent, but urgent. Its tides pulled farther, its waves came quicker. The winds howled strange songs between the columns. Snow dusted the highest cliffs, and even the olive tree dropped its last leaves. Visitors grew fewer, but Ione remained. She swept the stone paths each morning and lit a small oil lamp at the base of the spiral each night, not for warmth, but for presence. And in those still, cold nights, she began to hear something new. Not the statues, not her own thoughts, but dreams, not hers. Others single quotes, as though the temple had begun to echo the minds of those who had ever dreamed within it. One night, she heard a lullaby from a woman who had visited only once. Another, the deep laughter of a fisherman long past. A girl's whispered hope for her sick brother. A mother's silent grief folded into prayer. The temple held them all, like a vessel, like a heart. By the time spring returned, the statues had changed. Only subtly their expressions softened. Their forms no longer rigid, but relaxed. Not movement, memory settling, as if the dreams had begun to sculpt the stone from within. Visitors who came that season often left stunned, claiming the statues felt alive, that they seemed to breathe. Ione simply smiled and offered no explanations. Some truths are not for explaining, only for resting within one dusk. As the sky blushed with apricot light, a child arrived, barefoot, with sea-bright eyes and a crown of woven reeds on her head. She did not speak, she simply walked the temple paths, trailing her fingers along the stone. When she reached the spiral, she sat cross-legged beside it and sang a simple hum. Like wind curling through grass, Ione listened from afar. She did not interrupt. She did not approach. She simply heard. When the girl was done, she stood, kissed the spiral, and whispered, "You remember now." Then she turned and left, vanishing between the olive trees like a dream dispersing in daylight. That night, Ione dreamed of the first stone laid. She stood in a time before time, the sea younger, the cliffs untouched. A woman knelt at the center of what would become the sanctuary. She carried no tools, only silence, and into the soil she placed a small, smooth spiral stone. It pulsed once, then slept. That was the beginning, not of worship, not of empire, but of listening, of dream carving, and from that moment, the temple began, not as monument, but memory. Ione awoke with a single word on her tongue, M&M, memory. Not the past, but the presence that remembers, that holds, that becomes. She carved it gently into a small piece of wood and left it at the foot of the largest statue. And as she stepped away, the sea grew calm, the sky glowed, and a single petal from no known flower drifted down from above and landed upon the spiral. The temple had spoken, not in thunder, not in fire, but in remembrance. Some places do not fade, they wait. And when the world grows quiet enough, they return, not to be praised, but to dream once more with us. The next few weeks drifted by in a kind of sacred hush. Not silence, exactly. The wind still danced through the stone colonnades, birds still chirped in the early hours, and the sea never ceased its whispering. But there was a slowness, a softness to everything, as though the world had stepped one layer deeper into dreaming. Ione no longer felt the need to tend to the temple. It was as if it had begun to tend to itself. Wildflowers bloomed between cracks in the stones, not weeds, but oddly deliberate. Clusters of color, like offerings left by unseen hands. Moss crept gently up the bases of the statues, giving them a living patina, and a faint scent of myrrh and salt clung to the air. Though no one brought incense, and no brine reached the inner sanctum, each morning she would walk the spiral, once inward, once outward, in silence. She no longer wished, she no longer asked, she simply listened. And in that listening, she began to remember things that were not hers. A woman with silver hair painting stars on the ceilings of a forgotten hall. A boy crying beside a broken lyre. The strings snapped by grief. A young soldier laying down his spear, not in surrender, but in understanding. Each memory felt like a wave, lapping gently at the shore of her heart, arriving not to overwhelm, but to remind. The temple was not keeping history, it was keeping presence. One morning, just before dawn, Ione awoke to find the olive tree blooming. This alone was not strange. The tree had bloomed many seasons, but now, its blossoms were not white. They glowed faintly blue, and not with light from the sun, but with something older, more inward. She reached up and touched one, and a warm memory filled her mind. A girl not unlike herself, hundreds of years before. Standing beneath that same tree, alone, but not lonely, singing to the stone beneath her feet, and the stone impossibly humming back. Ione stumbled back. Her breath caught not in fear, but in awe. That morning, she did not walk the spiral. Instead, she sat by the tree and whispered, "Do you remember me?" The wind stilled, and the petals fluttered downward, not in decay, but in answer. Later that day, a traveler arrived. Not young, not old. His face bore the kind of lines that come from staring into two. Many horizons. He wore no sandals, carried no satchel, and yet he moved with purpose. Not like someone seeking the temple, but someone returning to it. He nodded to Ione as he passed, and as he crossed into the sanctuary, he whispered, "It's been long." Not to her, to the temple. Ione said nothing. She only watched. The man walked to the spiral. He removed a small stone from his cloak, not carved, not polished, just a pebble. He kissed it and placed it at the spiral's edge. And as he turned to leave, he murmured, "Dream well." That night, Ione did not sleep. Instead, she wandered the sanctuary by moonlight. The statues now seemed softer than ever, not less defined, but more approachable, like dreams ready to be dreamed again. She approached the smallest statue, a woman sitting cross-legged, head tilted as if listening to some distant melody. For the first time, Ione reached out and touched its cheek. Warm, not from the sun, not from her own body, but from something within the stone itself. She closed her eyes, and in a breath, she heard hundreds of voices, not shouting, not crying, humming, a low, eternal harmony, like the sea. If it had learned to sing, in the days that followed, more travelers came. But they did not come with questions. They came with memories. An old woman who spoke only in proverbs, leaving behind a braid of lavender. A quiet man who stayed just one. hours sketching the spiral over and over in charcoal until his fingers turned black. A mother with her baby, who simply rocked the child and whispered old lullabies until dusk. None asked for guidance, none asked for miracles. They came to remember, and the temple, in its own way, remembered them in return. Ione understood now. This place had never been about worship, not in the way scholars or priests believed. It was not a shrine to forgotten gods, or a place to beg favors from mythic beings. It was a threshold, a doorway between dream and memory, between silence and story, between past and becoming. The statues weren't effigies, they were anchors, sculpted dreams given form, so the dreamer could return, so the temple could keep its promise. And so, Ione changed her role. She no longer called herself caretaker, nor priestess, nor guide. She simply began to call herself the listener. And she knew it by echo, not the kind that bounces off walls, but the kind that fills the quiet parts of your chest when something familiar brushes your soul. One night, as rain whispered across the sea and wind curled through the broken columns, Ione dreamed again. She stood not in ruins, but in the temple as it once was, high-ceilinged and candlelit, filled with quiet voices and rustling robes. But this time, the dream did not belong to her. She saw people gathered, not to worship, not to study, but to sleep. The temple was not a hall of prayer. It was a sanctuary of dreams. And the statues, they did not watch. They remembered. Held the shape of every dream ever dreamt beneath their gaze. And in that dream, she understood. The temple had never fallen. It had simply rested, waiting for someone to remember how to dream it awake again. So now, dreamer, if ever you visit a place that feels like it's holding its breath, pause, sit, listen, and maybe, just maybe. By now, word of the temple that listens had spread beyond the coasts. Not loudly, not in headlines or formal decrees, but in stories passed by fairy captains and tea-sellers, in poems written on driftwood and chalk-scrawled walls. They said that somewhere on an isle touched by Apollo, a place once broken had begun to breathe again. Artists arrived next, not with canvas or paints at first, but with flutes, lyres, and voices tuned to the hush of wind. They didn't ask to perform. They didn't speak of concerts. They simply came and played by moonlight, by candlelight, barefoot on the ancient stone. Their songs were not loud. They were lullabies, prayers without gods, music made of dusk and olive leaves. The statues, long silent, seemed to lean ever so slightly, as if they, too, wished to listen. One woman, a sculptor named Lysandra, knelt before the sleeping lion at the temple's entrance. She didn't sketch or take measurements. She whispered to it, "I've carved marble my whole life," she said, but none of it ever listened back. Then she left a small offering, a chisel wrapped in velvet, and walked away with tears in her eyes. Later that evening, Ione found that same chisel resting gently against the lion's paw. The wind had not placed it there, nor had she. The village elders, once cautious, began to speak of things they'd forgotten. One recalled a childhood dream where the columns sang Dod. Another spoke of a sister who used to sleepwalk to the temple and whisper to the stones. They began leaving gifts not in reverence, but in gratitude. Loaves of bread baked with rosemary, small clay pots filled with fresh spring water, a child's drawing of the sun, crumpled and left in the olive branches. The temple did not ask for worship, it simply offered space for stillness, and in that stillness, something extraordinary began. Dreams shifted. People who visited the temple often returned with dreams that were vivid, strange and gentle, dreams not of fantasy but of memory. A woman saw her grandmother knitting by a fire, though she'd never known her. A young fisherman dreamed of a city beneath the sea, where every window faced the moon. A boy, no older than 7, dreamed of a statue reaching down and handing him a star. These dreams left people softened, not confused, not afraid, but quiet in the way trees are quiet before blooming. Ione kept no journal. Instead, she began carving tiny pieces of driftwood, shaped into abstract forms, spirals, waves, half-closed eyes. She left them along the temple's paths. When the wind was just right, they'd knock gently against each other like wind chimes without strings. She didn't name them. She didn't need to. One morning, after the first rains of autumn, she awoke to find a stranger seated in the inner sanctum. An old man, blindfolded, holding a lyre made of shell and bone. He didn't speak, he played. The notes drifted through the temple like mist, slow, longing, ancient, and as the music played, something stirred behind the marble statues. Not motion, not speech, but awareness, as if the temple was remembering how it used to dream, through music. When the song ended, the man bowed, not to Ione, but to the space itself, and walked away barefoot into the dawn. No name, no claim, only offering that night. Ione dreamed once more, but this dream was not hers. She stood as an observer in the forgotten age, when the temple was whole, when its gardens were full of starlit herbs and sleeping pilgrims. In the dream, a girl sat before a stone altar, her fingers tracing the spiral. Around her, the statues did not watch. They dreamed with her. Each carved form held a piece of her slumber, like a library of dreams recorded not in ink but in stone. The girl in the dream turned her head and looked directly at Ione. "You brought us back," she said softly, not with voice, not with hands, with silence. Then the dream faded, and Ione awoke with tears on her cheeks. The spiral at the center of the sanctuary had begun to change subtly. Each line, once shallow, now shimmered faintly with dew each morning, even when the earth was dry. Some said it was a trick of the light. Others whispered it was the breath of the old. Gods returning. Ione said nothing. She simply cleaned the spiral each dawn with a sprig of thyme dipped in rainwater, and the spiral pulsed with warmth beneath her touch. People stopped calling it the ruins. They began to call it the listening temple. Children asked to visit it on birthdays. Poets wrote lines and tucked them into the crevices. Between stones, elders came to nap beneath the olive tree. Even those who didn't believe in gods believed in peace, and the temple gave it freely, like sunlight on cool stone. One evening, as the sea turned lavender and nightbirds sang, Ione stood before the largest statue, a marble woman with closed eyes, hands open in offering for the first time. Ione placed her palm in the statue's. She did not expect it to move, but she felt something, not pressure, not warmth, a knowing, as if the statue had always been waiting for someone to complete the gesture. And in that moment, Ione understood something, even deeper. The temple wasn't built for gods, it was built for dreamers, and the statues, they did not sleep. They listened, they remembered, they waited until now. In every forgotten corner of the world, there are places like this, quiet, patient, timeless. All they ask is that we stop speaking long enough to dream with them.